playing this game has been a long time coming for me. I played the original Lands of Lore when I was probably around 5 or 6 years old, and it is a title that still holds fond memories for me to this day, and one I go back to play with some regularity. Even if I take off the nostalgia goggles for a moment and appraise the game objectively, it's hard to deny that it's probably one of the best of its kind. Detailed and rich artwork, simple yet engaging gameplay, and fantastical worlds with gripping characters made for a dungeon crawling experience that is hard to top. It's such an important game to me that it was the first ever video on this channel and continues to draw views despite suffering from my early audio and video editing skills. Or lack of skills, as would be more appropriate to say. Despite all this, I've never actually played another entry in the Lands of Lore series. I don't know why that is. Perhaps I was afraid it wouldn't live up to the high standard I would set upon it from the original. Regardless, I think now is the time. So I invite you to join me in finding our way back to the lands, and back into some long overdue dungeon crawling.
My long vision is not quite over.
What about the mortals? What protection will you offer them?
There is one who is cursed with the power to oppose Belial. But he rests in a Gladstone dungeon and has no understanding of his destiny.
Lands of Lore 2: Guardians of Destiny was released in 1997, more than 4 years after the original, and once again developed by Westwood Studios, the creators of the first game. This entry is a direct continuation of the story from Throne of Chaos, which ended with the evil sorceress Scotia vowing a curse as she breathed her last breaths, conquered by the heroes of Gladstone and the Ruby of Truth. This entry in the series adds a ton to the lore of the world, some explained in the game, but most of the background to what's going on is described in the user manual. I'm going to give a very abridged version, but it's still a lot. I know starting a video with a big lore dump isn't the most exciting thing, but trust me, it's a good story. Essentially, there are ancient beings in existence, known simply as the Ancients. It's unclear whether the Ancients found our world, or actually created it, but essentially our world is a break from the tedium of being omnipotent, all-powerful beings. It gave them the one experience they couldn't find elsewhere, the experience of not being in charge. That said, the Ancients wanted to leave our world as an untouched place that they could experience, but not affect. So they made agreements to never interfere with the mortal world. This worked for a time, and the world was experienced by the Ancients, but not interfered upon by them. Unfortunately, like all good creation mythos, one ancient decided he didn't want to follow these rules anymore. His name was Belial, and opposed to the will of the other ancients, he gave favor and power to the Dracoid race. His intervention fueled a bloodlust in the Dracoid that could only be quenched by conquest. The Hue line took more casualties from the Dracoid invasion than other races, due to their proximity to the Dracoid kingdom. Eventually, with the Hue line on the brink of extinction, another ancient could sit idly no longer. Anu, also known as the Drauracle, stepped in and armed the remaining Hue line with ancient magic of their own, tipping the scales back into their favor in the war with the Dracoid. This saved the Hue line and brought some semblance of balance back to the lands. But unfortunately, in the eyes of the ancients, both Belial and the Drauracle were guilty of the same crime, interference in the lives of mortals. The punishment for this crime would be for Belial to be executed and the Drauracle to carry out the execution. Belial knew this was coming, and used his power to create the magical Mother Beast, a creature that would feed on ancient magic and eventually be able to affect his rebirth. Unfortunately for Belial, his plan failed. After his execution, the remainder of the ancients had been soured on the idea of interacting with mortality in general, and decided to leave the world for good. With their departure left all of the ancient magic, meaning the Mother Beast would go dormant and Belial could not be reborn. Regardless, the Drauracle, feeling some responsibility for the world so changed by the arrival of the Ancients, decided to stay as the Guardian of Destiny, and ensure our world would never again be ruled by an evil god. And this would have been the end of our story, if it weren't for the unexpected rising of a new evil force. The sorceress Scotia, filled with an unquenchable hatred for Gladstone and its King Richard, sought and found the Nether Mask, an item of great shape-changing power. Unknown to Scotia, this mask was fueled by ancient magic, enough of it to awaken the Mother Beast, who would begin sending out nightmarish creatures in search of any sources of ancient magic. Scotia was soon after killed, and the king was saved, but in her dying breath, Scotia transferred the power of the mask to her son, Luther. This transfer did not happen smoothly, and instead of gaining the power of the mask, Luther was cursed. He would now change at random between three forms: his human form, the form of a lizard, and most grotesque of all, the form of a twisted, hulking beast. Our part in the story is to control Luther. Guilty of little more than being born to a terrible mother, he is seeking a cure for the curse that she's lain upon him when he's arrested unjustly by the Gladstone guards. The imprisonment doesn't last long, however, with some timely mutations allowing Luther to escape the guards into a distant cave. Unarmed, mutating out of control, and all of Gladstone hot on our heels, our quest begins in a damp cave. As always, a short interlude here to talk about the gameplay before we dive into the meat of the game. This entry is over 4 years removed from its predecessor, and it shows in almost every way. Some vaguely common elements still remain, but overall, this game has a completely different feel from Throne of Chaos. For starters, we no longer get to choose a hero to play as. You play as Luther, and that's it. You do interact with the many denizens of this world through chat and scripted encounters, some of them returning from the first game, but no longer will you be building a party to face down your enemies. This is a solo journey. That doesn't mean you're helpless, though. Rather than having a party with many abilities, Luther is now able to do it all. And by it all, I mean two things: combat and magic. The thievery/rogue subtype has been removed from this entry entirely. No more lockpicking, and ranged weapons now just affect your combat skills. Melee combat works how you'd expect. Get in close and press attack until your enemy dies. At a range, your melee attack is replaced with a ranged one. Generally, this will be a bow or a crossbow, but mid to late game you get all sorts of magical versions, so you'll be shooting fire, ice, and lightning storms before you know it. Magic is similar to the first entry in that you get a book with spells, and you can cast spells with a limited regenerating mana pool. Unlike the first game, each spell has 4 standard variants and 1 ancient variant. Each level will still fulfill its purpose, but with a slightly different effect. Let's take the heal spell group as an example. Level 1 is lesser heal, pretty standard. Level 2 is a poison cure. Level 3 is a damage shield, and level 4 is greater healing. The ancient version is a heal over time regenerate spell. Which level of the spell you cast depends on how long you charge, and charging too long sends you back to level 1, so you have to time your charges well to cast the spell you want. It sounds simple, but combine this with a horde of monsters attacking and wonky DOS controls, and you have a recipe for disaster. Probably the most interesting sounding spell group is the Prism spells, with Blind, Invisibility, Hologram, Photon Blade, and Trinity. But I never found the Prism spell, so I'm just left to read about it in the manual and wonder what could have been. Sigh. I did find a shield that granted invisibility at one point, but it was pretty much useless, so maybe I didn't miss much. Both your combat and magic abilities will level up as you use them. No real thought needs to be put into this. You passively level as the game progresses, with hard caps on level in certain areas, so you never get too overpowered. It's a decent balance for the most part. Speaking of not putting thought into things, let's talk about the main focus of our quest and one of the most major parts of the gameplay: curse transformations. This is easily my least favorite mechanic in the game. Essentially, completely at random, and generally outside your control, you'll change into either a lizard or a beast. This transformation will last somewhere between 30 seconds and a few minutes. Most egregiously, up to as much as 20 minutes if you're extremely unlucky. The transformations make sense from a story perspective. It is a curse, and we're trying to be rid of it. If we had complete control, it would be a powerful ability, as it was in the hands of our mother Scotia. The problem here is how it meshes into gameplay. It doesn't. In your lizard form, you're small, move fast, and have slightly improved magic, but no melee ability. This form isn't completely terrible, but it's a real burden if you're trying to explore and are suddenly stuck at essentially a crouched height. Getting to things higher up or on ledges is a chore, and as this is a DOS game, looking up and down is not as smooth as you might expect. Generally, being morphed into a lizard is a burden, but it's bearable. The real frustration comes from the beast transformation. As the beast, you move much slower, pretty well can't jump, and are much bigger, once again distorting your perspective. Oh, and you can't cast magic at all. The trade-off here is that you're supposedly more able in melee combat, but truthfully, once you've found a few weapon upgrades, Luther in his human form is going to do a much better job. Also, the beast form will have difficulty getting a date. This is in the user manual, so it is canon. The real problem with these transformations, outside just making navigation slightly obnoxious, is that there are multiple segments where you need to be in one form or another to complete a task, and you really have almost no control over when you'll transform. So a lot of the time you'll need to be in a specific form, and have no recourse but to stand around like an idiot awaiting the proper transformation. There were multiple points in the game where this was a problem, but the worst occurred near the end of the game. I needed to get up a 2-foot high wall, but the game decided that it was time for me to be a beast. The beast has no real jumping ability, so I was forced to just stand there and wait for a transformation back to human form. This took nearly 20 minutes. That may not sound so long, but the game giving you zero recourse other than to just stand and stare at a wall for 20 minutes is some of the most frustrating gameplay I can imagine. And with the game being pretty well on rails, it's not like you can go off and do something else while you wait. You really are forced to just stand there. This would happen continuously throughout my playthrough, usually in shorter bursts, but unendingly throughout the game. You do gain some extremely limited control over the curse, but not until very late in the game. So for the majority of your playthrough, this will be a constant headache. I feel like the mechanic could have been improved so much if it were just tied to scripted encounters, or the game let us control it earlier on. As it stands, it's almost frustrating enough to make me not want to recommend the game. But luckily, the game has a lot of merits that help make up for this shortcoming. In terms of exploring, the game is different but similar to the first in that you wander about solving various people's problems and solving puzzles in dungeons, all with the ultimate goal of defeating Belial and ending your curse. I found the puzzles in this entry to be a bit less obvious than the first game. Like in the first game, you'd often need to get an item, bring it to a place, and that would open progress. You sort of do that here, but the formula's been expanded quite a bit. This is unfortunate in that it means trying to figure out what you're supposed to do can oftentimes be a game of just guessing. And there are definitely parts of the game where I feel like I lucked into a solution rather than solving anything on my own. For example, at one point in the game you enter a room with a corpse, some offering bowls, and a sunken altar. No hints on what the game wants. What you're supposed to do is go into the next room and gather 2 alchemy ingredients. Then put those ingredients into the correct offering bowls. This will raise the altar in the room. Next, you need to drag the corpse onto the altar and it will disappear in a blast of lightning, no indication of where it went. Much later in the level, you will find the corpse again in a lower area. You once again need to drag it, this time onto a conveyor belt, where it gets ground into mush. You then take that mush and push it into another machine that turns it into a statue. That statue can be inserted into a cubby in a secret room, which will give you a stone that you must then use to balance a counterweight in yet another room to finally progress. To add an extra level of confusing here, this happens in a fairly large level with multiple rooms that aren't even necessary to progress. So you'll be wandering trying to figure out what areas are required and which are just fluff. There are so many points in this where a player can get lost. The alchemy ingredients are just normal usable ingredients. There's a good chance you might see them and think, hey, those are useful, use them up, and then find yourself soft-locked. Or the interaction with the corpse itself. There is nothing to indicate that you need to turn a corpse into a statue. It was literally just guesswork on my part dragging the guy around. This, and many puzzles like it, make it the sort of game where you feel like you want to have a walkthrough on hand to figure out what to do when you hit a roadblock. There is a fine line between making a challenge difficult enough to engage the player and making it too obscure as to just be confusing, and I unfortunately feel that more often than not, Guardians doesn't quite hit the mark. Anyhow, not to be all doom and gloom, one thing I was a big fan of here was the full motion video for some of the enemies and most of the NPC encounters. While not exactly a gameplay element, it makes the game feel somehow more human. And it sort of reminds you that a bunch of grown men and women in the 90s took it upon themselves to put on cat costumes and deliver some absurdly cheesy performances to be immortalized for all time in a DOS video game. Just super wholesome stuff, and honestly gives the game an interesting feel and look throughout. Speaking of feels, this game certainly comes across a bit more tongue-in-cheek than its predecessor. I won't say Throne of Chaos was a serious game per se. It definitely had its share of silliness from time to time, but the tone was certainly much darker and foreboding. Guardians maintains an almost goofy atmosphere throughout, with our hero often quipping one-liners and making light of just about anything that happens to him. A lot of this is heightened by the FMV, just giving it that extra layer of cheese it wouldn't have without it. In terms of physical progression in the game world, it's sort of broken up into 3 hubs plus a prologue area. And once you finish an area, the previous one is blocked off. There is some bizarre pacing to this. To give a timeline to show what I mean, during my playthrough I spent about 4.5 hours in part 1, about 10 hours in part 2, and about 3 hours in part 3. Part of this can be blamed on my getting stuck on a couple puzzles, but really the majority of this game is in the second zone. They took the time to break the game up into these individual hubs, but it feels like so much focus was on that second area, and the third was so woefully short. Most annoyingly of all, the first area is easily the most enjoyable. It has a ton of characters to interact with, nice colorful biomes, and a good sense of direction. The second part felt significantly more confusing, and had an absurd amount of backtracking, most of it very tedious. The third part was, once again, not too bad, but lacked the NPC interaction of the first 2 areas. Well, we left Luther cowering for his life in a cave some time ago at this point. I think it's about time we see how that's going. The game world opens up just where we left off. We are in a cave as a lizard, Gladstone tight on our heels. Pretty soon we re-enter our human form and need to find an armament. Those giant crystals all over the place will make a good club, and we have access to the spark and healing spells right off the bat. Let's teach the Gladstone guards making illegal arrests is not to be tolerated. This area serves as a pretty safe exploration zone to get comfortable with the game. The guards are pretty hapless and can be dispatched with ease. There's even a quasi-scripted event where you become the Beast and learn that you can move giant boulders. You never use this ability again. At least, I never found the opportunity to. Oh well, it's here at least. A bit deeper in the cave, we find a wounded orc. He says we're now the leader of the Dark Army since Scotia is dead, and that he has a gift for us, but then promptly dies due to his wounds. I don't know about any of that, but he's the only orc in the game. Poor guys were murdered to near extinction in the last entry. Hashtag justice for Timothy. Coming to the end of the cave, we bump into Kenneth, lead guard hunting us. I love this guy's FMV actor. He does a great job. We steal his crossbow and make a dash for the very conveniently nearby Draurical chamber. The Draurical sends Kenneth away, and despite our pleading, still refuses to interfere with the affairs of mortals to rid us of our curse. He does give us direction to head to the southern continent, home of the Hue Line, to search for answers there. Exiting his chamber, there's a portal waiting to take us away, but a secret chamber off to the side is a better choice. Within is all sorts of strange stuff, most of which I have literally no explanation for, but notably we grab a powerful prism sword and the remains of a broken greatsword. That will be useful later. We hitch a ride on a dragon and are off to the southern continent. Arriving at the village gates, we're stopped and told entry will be prohibited until a missing girl can be found. The next areas are some of the most memorable to me. We'll be exploring the jungle, fighting discount displacer beasts and raptors, continually at odds with our curse. Throughout the jungle, we have multiple scripted encounters with the Hue Line, most also engaged in the search for the missing girl. Eventually we come to the jungle shop of Kit Yara, Weirdly enough, there's no real economy in this game, and she just lets you take what you want. We even grab some bracers here that I wear for the rest of the game. I have literally no idea what they do, but they fill a slot in my inventory, so we're taking them. She tells us about a second group of Huline that are less civilized, living deeper in the jungle, embracing their savage nature. Her son is part of this tribe, and she tells us how she misses him dearly. This becomes relevant later. Heading out of her hut, we eventually come to the Hine Caves. Within, we find a beast known as the Executioner, your average fantasy trope of village monster that is the cause of all woes. We take him out with no problems, and deeper in the cave, find our first hive warrior. We don't know it yet, but these critters are being birthed by the mother beast to track down ancient magic to aid in Belial's resurrection. We kill him too, and sadly come across the bones of the missing girl. Looks like we were too late for her, but an older Huline is there as well, and we're at least able to get her to safety. Not quite a success, but not quite a failure either. We head back to the Huline village. They're distraught over the death of the girl, but cats of their word, they open up the gates. There's a lot to do in the village and a ton of NPCs to interact with. Most here are unhelpful, but there is a Huline fond of levitation who seems to have some knowledge of ancient magic. He can't help with our curse, but offers to fix our broken greatsword from earlier if we bring him a power orb. Noted. Toward the back of the settlement is a cantina, and entering we come across none other than Bakata, your loyal companion from Throne of Chaos. The game is so excited to reintroduce him that it immediately crashes to the desktop. Maybe that was just a fluke. We reload, walk back in, and it crashes again. Uh-oh. An annoying issue, but with some help from the internet we find a solution. Turning the graphics to minimal in the game files, logging in, finishing the Bakata interaction, then turning the graphics back up gets us through. Thank goodness. I can't let my Lands of Lore experience be ended by something as silly as a technical issue. Anyhow, Bakata has his character changed some. He comes across as a bit more of a crotchety old man, tired and unmotivated by much except protecting Dawn, who is apparently at a nearby monastery. He wants to arrest us for escaping Gladstone, but says they have bigger worries, so he lets us go under the condition that we meet him later to turn ourselves in. Deal. We make a beeline to the monastery to talk with Dawn. She's not super helpful, stating similar to Bakata that she's working on something more important than our curse, but tells us to chat with someone else at the monastery, Brother Julian. The brother is a bit skeptical of our curse at first, but warms up to us when we mention that we were sent by the Drauracle. He talks a lot, but ultimately says he can't help us without a copy of the ancient runes found back in the Hine Caves. He does drop a hint that the last copy they had was pressed into wax. So taking the subtle hint, we ensure we pilfer some beeswax from a nearby hive before returning to the caves. Back in the caves, we're able to find a now accessible ancient ruins area at the back, and an elevator that we can use to descend deeper still. At the end of all this, we come to a promising room, but it is far too dark to see anything. Luckily, we're a mage of no small skill, and can light the nearby brazier to shed some light on things. We take a couple wax pressings of the runes and make our way back out. Awaiting us at the exit is Dawn. She pokes at us for information, and we give her a copy of the runes. She doesn't really give us anything for this and teleports away. Just like the first game. All talk, no action. Back to the monastery, Brother Julian is only slightly more useful. He lets us know the runes have given him no information to help us, but points us to the Huline temple in the savage jungle for answers. He also gives us a power orb for our troubles. I think we needed one of those. We are just about done in this section of the jungle. A couple more stops. Before heading to the savage jungle, we bump into Kit Yara. She gives us a sword to give to her son Daniel. Could help us get in good with his tribe if need be. Next, we head back to the village and pay the price of 1 power orb to have our broken greatsword repaired by the sorcerer. It's still a really crappy weapon, but don't worry, it has another upgrade coming later. All good things in time. One final promise to keep. We told Bakata that we would meet him to turn ourselves in. Don't really want to do that, but we can at least find him and maybe bargain for time. We find Bakata off relaxing in the jungle. He agrees to give us more time, but we'll need to instruct the guards that have been chasing us to leave us alone. There is a very 90s, super awkward and drawn out escort scene here. When we finally make it to the guards, a giant swarm of hive warriors arrive to destroy the bridge. Bakata and the guards head back that way to find Dawn, and we're left to our own devices in the savage jungle. We get a silly little animation of Kenneth giving chase into the jungle. He apparently thinks we're in league with the creatures. Oh, Kenneth, you big joker. In the jungle, we immediately bump into Daniel and his tribe of savage Hewline. Things are going okay, but then a swarm of grasshopper bugs interrupt. We didn't get the chance to give him the sword from his mother, but we'll catch up with him before long. Surprisingly nearby is the Hewline temple we're seeking. There is a friendly-ish keeper at the gate who lets us know the temple is sealed and we won't be able to get in without a dreamstone, all of which are at the Great Forge up in the mountains, guarded by the mysterious Ruloi. Just as he finishes speaking, the door to the temple crashes open and a creepy malformed Belial clone steals the keeper and retreats within. Guess it couldn't be that easy. We need to get into the mountains. Time to look to our local guide here for some direction. We weasel our way into the savage Hewline village with Daniel's sword as an offering. Daniel is grateful for the sword, but lets us know we won't be able to reach the mountains. The pass is guarded by a nigh invincible Larchon. Remember the Larchon? It's one of those big worm beasts from Throne of Chaos that required a special green skull to kill it. Ah, the memories. Anyhow, outside that tidbit of knowledge, Daniel's kinda served his usefulness here. A visit to the village shaman, and we learn that the Larchon can be put to sleep, but the tribe won't help us unless we join them. Okay then, sign me up, I'll be in the tribe. Not so easy, unfortunately. They have an initiation ritual. I will need to find a silver leaf and return it to the shaman to be admitted into the tribe. Just one thing after another with these damn cats. He gives us the key to the Dracoid cemetery and we make our way out of there to find the leaf. This is probably the most tedious stretch of the game. I'm going to skip over a lot of details here, but know that I do it to save you from the confusing mess that is the rest of this particular quest. Here are the bullet points. In the cemetery are about a dozen or so locked tombs. Each is sealed by one of 3 colored orbs: yellow, white, or blue. Within the cemetery, and larger savage jungle region as a whole, you can find uncharged orbs. To charge these orbs, you'll need to find their associated charging stations. In total, we're going to need 2 white, 2 blue, and 1 yellow. Or more if you want to get all the items in the cemetery. The yellow charging station is easy enough to find. It's within the maze under the cemetery. A bit tedious to access, but not so bad. The next will have you exiting the cemetery into the Dracoid ruins across the jungle. The ruins themselves are a bit of a death trap, with living stone columns using deadly poison and the Sar, a reptilian race that seem to have taken up residence in the ruins and have no interest in playing nice. We can skim the edges of the ruins to reach a tower. Ascending the tower, we find the white globe charging station, and at the top we come across the only Sar willing to speak with us. He's not very nice, so we introduce him to our fist. Beyond the crotchety Sar, we pick up the Bracers of the Dead. They let us speak to the dead. Hilariously enough, you can speak to the Sar we just killed. He really doesn't have much to say. He just says talking to the dead is bad. Well, stop talking to me then. Back to the cemetery, we open one of the white globe tombs, which in turn allows us to open an unmarked tomb. In that tomb is a barrel we roll back into the white tomb, which we then explode to make a hole into a different part of the catacombs. After getting lost in the catacombs for a while, we find the final charger and can get the blue orbs. Back on the surface and through the blue door, we come into yet another mausoleum. Maybe the silver leaf is here. Nope, it's a ghost. He's a Dracoid priest and he says he can help us with the silver leaf, but we must first find his remains, burn them, and return them here for proper burial. His remains are in the ruins. Back to the ruins we go. Returning to the ruins, the priest's remains are literally in the back-ass corner of this place, far removed from anything else of interest. They are so far back that I almost thought I'd stumbled into an out-of-bounds area. We finally get there, burn the remains, scoop them into a jar. No fast travel here, so the trek back to the cemetery begins. Returning the ashes to the cemetery, the ghost, being an absolute piece of shit, says he can't actually give us the silver leaf, but he knows a guy who can, and he can make the introduction for us. The Emperor of the Dracoid. The priest vanishes into the afterlife, and we get access to yet another tomb. This one requires one of each orb to open. Luckily, we've been amassing a collection. We chat with the ghostly emperor. He fully admits to being able to give us the silver leaf, but he won't. He is ashamed of the Dracoid's past affiliation with Belial, and wants to sink the remaining ruins underwater to hide his shame forever. I mean, it sorta seems like me the good and moral thing to do would be to help the guy in front of you, instead of sinking your city for vanity's sake. But yeah, you've definitely changed your race for the better, bastard. He's unflinching in his resolve, so our only option is to complete yet another errand. We need to take his body and place it before the statue of Belial in the ruins. This will bring life to the statue, which will in turn kill a giant worm under the ruins, effectively destabilizing the place and sinking it forever. Let's go then. I saw the Belial statue on our last 2 visits, so at least I know where I'm going. Placing his body before the statue has the intended effect, and the statue begins to move, but it won't leave the room. I waited a long while, thinking this was another part of the game's wonkiness, but it wasn't. Apparently the statue is supposed to blow a hole in the wall and leave, but it wouldn't do that for me. Some more fidgeting with the graphical settings somehow fixes this, and our quest resumes. Another close call, Lands of Lore. As advertised, the Belial statue fights the worm in a kinda rad cutscene, and the city begins to sink. It's sinking with us in it. We really didn't think this through. We flee down the flooding tunnels onto some floating debris, and one dramatic rush later we awaken on the shore with Dawn overlooking us. I guess we lived. Dawn says she's going off to do some useless nonsense while we do all the real work again. But she does at least give us a curse control spell. It lets us morph into the lizard at will. Not really great, but it's something at least. Oh, she also takes our Speak to Dead bracers. Rude. Back to the cemetery to finish this Dracoid nonsense once and for all. The Emperor says something. We can't understand the dead anymore, since Dawn stole our bracers, but he at least seems happy and vanishes. Silver leaves start growing all over the cemetery. Victory at last. I take a whole pile of the things to be safe, and we can finally move on from here. Back at the Hewline tribe, the shaman takes the leaf, but says we have one final trial before joining the tribe. We need to defeat Daniel in combat. Daniel is actually a pretty tough fight, and I learned this is a one-way fight to the death, as in, if I lose, I'm killed, but when we win, Daniel just says, enough, and the fight is considered over. Sort of unsportsmanly. Anyway, we're officially members of the tribe now. We get the Larchon tranquilizer and move into the mountains past the now sleepy beast. The mountains are cool, but not terribly story relevant. We find a barbarian village, find a cool axe and a bow, and even float around on some ice floes. Towards the end, we unceremoniously find the corpse of Kenneth, the Gladstone guard. I'm pretty bummed out by this. I thought Kenneth was going to have a whole redemption arc. Instead, he just lies face down dead in the snow. Sad. Eventually we find Bakata. He isn't doing too well. He's injured at the foot of the Ruloi Citadel. He says that Dawn has been captured and we need to rescue her. Of course, he won't be helping. You were much more useful in the first game, Bakata. Inside the Citadel, the place is alien and strange. All the buttons look like eyeballs, and the Ruloi themselves are flying creatures wielding powerful magics. They are a pain to fight, but the trick is to just keep moving. We eventually reach the prisoner cells. The first we find don't contain Dawn, but instead contain a bunch of women. They claim the Ruloi are stealing their feminine energy or some such nonsense. I don't know about any of that noise, but I'm fairly certain the larger woman at the back is Kenneth in drag. I'm glad he's doing okay. We come to Dawn's cell next, but she can't be released without the Dreamstone, the one we came here for in the first place. Luckily, it's much simpler to acquire than the Silver Leaf. On the topmost level of the Citadel is the Forge. We come across another Belial abomination in a fight with the Ruloi. Guess they aren't friends. The Belial clone sort of speaks, but you can tell the lights aren't quite on. He's surprisingly easy to dispatch, and before you know it, we're in the Great Forge, powered by the Dreamstone we need. Before taking the stone, let's empower the Greatsword we've been lugging around literally the entire game. This creates the Enchanted Greatsword. Not the most fabulous name, but this is, I believe, the most powerful weapon in the game. Able to destroy most enemies in a couple of swings and create lightning storms on contact. Cool. We grab the stone, free Dawn, and head back to the Hewline Temple. Finally breaking through that door, about 8 hours of game time later, we find the very dead keeper and the puzzle I described in the gameplay section from earlier. I won't rehash it, but despite its sort of cryptic nature, it is a bit of a neat set piece. Anyhow, with that puzzle out of the way, the next portion of the temple revolves around completing 3 challenge rooms. One is a jumping challenge, one involves moving through fire and ice, and one is about tilting a platform with enemies. All 3 complete, we move to the final section of the temple. There is a sinking platform here. The trick to get it to descend is to cover it in corpses so it has enough weight on it, and then ride it to the bottom. I feel like there's probably a Cannibal Corpse song about this. Rotted Body Landslide? Maybe not. At the bottom, another mutant Belial awaits. This one speaks more clearly. They are definitely becoming more sentient. Again, super easy to take down, and we move to the last chamber with an empty pedestal. Placing the Dreamstone on it causes the City of the Ancients to rise from the sea. The game was starting to lose me a little at this point, but the cinematic of this happening was actually really gripping, with the slow ascent, dragons flying peak to peak, and the dramatic flare of music as you arrive. Makes the quest feel so much more grand than romping around in a jungle. Loading in, we find ourselves on a grand balcony overlooking the city. Our mission here is simple. We need to visit each of the 4 towers surrounding the area, travel through the associated portals, grant power to each segment, and finally raise the central area of the city so we can access the Mantle of the Ancients. This area was actually a pretty good time. The puzzles involved with each tower were unique, but quick enough as to not feel like it was dragging on. Overall, this entire section was very enjoyable. The problem here is there are virtually none of the NPC interactions that we had from the previous sections of the game. Anyhow, each tower active, we move to the central area. Yet again, another mutant Belial awaits. This one proves a bit more of a challenge. Not because he's difficult, but because the game will not stop transforming me into the beast. And the beast has been completely useless in any capacity since about the time I left the first Hewline village. My strategy is to just run in circles from the boss until I revert to human form, and then turn the twisted Belial into a mushy paste. In the next room, we gain the Mantle of the Ancients. I'm not sure if this is an item or an empowerment, but it essentially makes us a pseudo-ancient ourselves. We now have unlimited access to all our level 5 spells, and more importantly, we can finally control our curse. It's our choice when we morph now. Thank goodness, I will never again have to be the beast. With our newly acquired powers, we're able to move below the city into the lair of the Mother Beast. This segment is a big confusing maze where the goal is to find the exit while larger and larger swarms of enemies pile on you. Even empowered as we are, fighting is a death sentence, so the best bet is to run. I don't have much more to say about this area, but it was really creepy and atmospheric, so it deserves a bit of a shout out. Escaping the tunnels, we come to Belial's lair, and in a devastating turn of events find Bakata made his way here first. He is in mortal combat with the statue of Belial we resurrected earlier. Being the true Thunder Chad he always was, Bakata destroys the statue and with his dying breath lets us know Dawn is further inside. We need to find her. She stands no chance against the resurrected Belial without the mantle. The lair itself is really just a sewer level. There are a few paths you can take, but will ultimately find yourself in the birthing chamber. Before entering, we catch up to Dawn. She is luckily okay and not trapped in an orb like last time. She doesn't even ask if Bakata is okay. Like, that dude gave his life for you and you don't even care. Should've left her in that orb in Throne of Chaos. Anyhow, she pretty well tells us everything is up to us, and out of left field gives us the Ruby of Truth. The same one we used to stop Scotia in Throne of Chaos. I mean, sure, why not? Moving into the birthing chamber is a weird blob. We release our curse into it and Belial is born, but in a weakened state. He runs off, and the name of the game here is to try and catch him before he can regain all his power. The first obstacle he throws our way is Scotia, our mother. The FMV version of her is no less hideous than the pixelated one we got 4 years prior. She says some not so nice things to Luther, and we go 2 for 2 and dispel her with the Ruby of Truth. Lady needs to learn to talk less. Next challenger thrown our way in this gauntlet is the Draurical. He claims to be the real deal and tries to stop us, but a few swings of our sword shows that to be false, and we dispel him as readily as Scotia. Yet another illusion. Just Belial left. Face to face with the resurrected god, he takes a very mocking tone, but proves to be a super easy fight. Like, I have to admit, I was pretty disappointed with how easily he died. I didn't even get to use my sword orb I'd been saving the entire game. Oh well, just a testament to how far we've come. When he is killed, he makes a really awkward statement about never returning here, and keels over dead.
Schemes up your sleeve. Rest assured, my young valiant, I have no plans to return to this place ever again.
In the next scene, we cut to the Drauracle interrupting some special time between Luther and Dawn. I didn't really pick up on the romantic vibes throughout the adventure. More seemed like Dawn was dismissive of Luther throughout the game and only helped him when it was convenient for her. But I mean, I'm a dude reviewing 90s games on YouTube. Maybe understanding women isn't my specialty. Anyhow, the Drauracle lets us know that Belial is gone and any further problems we have are ours to deal with, and he vanishes. Luther and Dawn show no reaction and return to their activities. Roll credits. My usual review section will be absent this video, mostly because I feel I have mixed feelings on this title myself, and I wouldn't feel right critiquing others when my own opinions may be a bit muddy. Unfortunately, as much as I wanted this game to live up to my expectations after Throne of Chaos, it simply can't. The games are different enough, however, that it is difficult to make the direct comparison as to why one is better than the other. Guardians made a damn valiant attempt to bring the graphics forward, still using pre-rendered scenes and imposing FMV on top of that, and in some instances this was extremely effective. But unfortunately, area to area, the world was not nearly as attractive as that of its predecessor. Add in the attempt at 3D, and all the wonky world warping that caused in early titles meant you often found your screen looking like a soup sandwich. I wouldn't go so far as to call the world they created for this ugly, but it just wasn't as memorable outside those interesting FMV moments. It's just sort of bland. Throne of Chaos was rich and detailed, and each area sticks out as a distinct memory in my mind. In terms of audio, I found this entry to be very similar to the original. The quality of the sound effects was as passable as the first, the music was good, and while the voice acting was cheesy, it wasn't bad by any means. Now, one thing I will mention is the content of that voice acting. The first game had its tongue-in-cheek moments, but overall had a story that felt important and impactful. You were fighting for the life of your king and your home. You were good, and they were evil. It had weight and importance in the mind of the player. Here, everything feels like a bit of a joke. Right from the start, even. The guards chasing you in the cave come across as dolts. Kenneth is not a serious character, but more of a bumbling fool. The Gladstone guards in the original were daunting. Here, they're fodder enemies. Luther is continually quipping in every interaction he has. I felt like I was playing as Guybrush Threepwood. Even with the final interaction with Belial, it's supposed to be a fight to ensure an evil god doesn't regain control of the world, and it just feels silly and unimportant. Gameplay-wise, I would argue there are some improvements. I felt the streamlining of melee and magic, and the removal of thievery was a good choice. Magic itself felt much more useful here, with some good utility built in. The improved maneuverability in the world felt like a good thing and a step forward from the original. I love the 2D dungeon crawler as much as the next guy, but this was 1997. The future was 3D, and it was time to evolve or be passed by. Also, any excuse to avoid the 2D dungeon crawler staple of spinning floor tiles to disorient the player. Cannot be happier that's gone. Do I think they did it perfectly? No. But it's a damn sight better than a lot of early DOS 3D games I've played in the past. Even the limited platforming never really felt tedious, outside of having to wait for transformations, which is its own issue. In spite of all I've said on this title, it may seem like this video is veering toward a negative review, but I'll be honest, it's not. Was this a frustrating experience? Yep. Was I often confused and lost at what to do next? You bet. But did I enjoy myself? Absolutely. It is so hard to pinpoint the quality of a game that makes it special, but to me this one had it. The lore was expanded and changed for this entry, and while that can be a death knell if done wrong, here it felt right. The backstory fit well in my mind with the lore that already existed, and did nothing but improve it and further engross me into what already existed. It was a clunky experience, and one that left me oft exasperated, but also one that was extremely memorable and left me wishing there was more. My biggest disappointment with the game was the diminishing NPC and story interactions as the game went on. There was such an engrossing world to be found in the first area in the Hewline jungle, and as the game progressed we saw less and less of it. I would have loved to see a version of this game where that element was explored in depth. All I will say as a final remark, if you did enjoy Throne of Chaos, I absolutely recommend you give this one a go. Just be prepared for a different experience. While this title didn't exactly capture the quality of the first, I do think it at least captured some of its spirit. That's enough for me, and I hope it's enough for you. See you in the next video.